back to God in the 8-inch frying pan. My name is Alicia Cash, and this is Larry Isabel. And we are going to be talking about the second book. What are we talking about, Larry?
We're talking about that. We're still talking about that first sermon, I believe, right?
Are we talking about the first sermon or the second sermon?
The first one, I think. Let me.
I am not alone with my anxiety. I thought we were talking about the woman that Jesus called a dog.
Oh yeah, that's the one. Is that the second one?
Yeah, that's the second one.
Okay.
The
Yeah,
Silence
that's
of
the
God.
one.
Okay, so we're talking about
Sorry,
The Silence
folks.
of God. In the book The Silence of God by Helmut Thielicke.
Helmut Thielicke.
And there will be an audio recording of Larry reading that book for you, in case you don't have it. And we'll also have it available in the Amazon links down below. So if you want to pick it up there, you can support the channel through that. We do get a little bit of money when you buy through us, but you don't have to. You can also buy it on all sorts of other platforms like Half Price Books or wherever you want to buy your books. So.
The Thielicke sermon is based on Matthew chapter 15, verses 21 through 28. Famously known as the story of the Cannite woman.
Then Jesus went thence, and departed into the coast of Tyre and Sidon. And behold, a woman of Canaan came out of the same coast, and cried unto him, saying, Have mercy on me, O Lord, thou son of David. My daughter is grievously vexed with a devil. But he answered her not a word. And his disciples came and besought him, saying, Send her away, for she crieth after us. But he answered and said, I am not sent but unto the lost sheep of the Lord of Israel, or of the house of Israel. Then came she and worshipped him, saying, Lord, help me. But he answered and said, It is not meet to take the children's bread and cast it to the dogs. And she said, Truth, Lord, yet the dogs eat of the crumbs which fall from their master's table. Then Jesus answered and said unto her, O woman, great is thy faith. Be it unto thee even as thou wilt. And her daughter was made whole from that very hour. Now that was actually talked about then. Let me see. So that same interaction was talked about in
Mark's Gospel, yes. Yeah, that same story appears in Mark's Gospel. And where is it in Mark, though? It is... Where was it in Mark?
I don't have
Chapter
that
7,
written down.
maybe?
Yeah, I don't have it written down.
Chapter 7 or 8. I know I have it in my notes, but I have so many notes.
That is why we have the internet. Mark 7:24-37.
So the same story appears in... we're dealing with Matthew 15, 21 through 28, and it's in Mark chapter 7,
24-37.
24 through 37. So sometimes it's very instructive, oftentimes, to compare how each gospel writer tells a story, because oftentimes they tell the story a little bit differently for their own purposes of communication. And sometimes it's helpful to compare and contrast the different ways of telling which appear in the Gospels. So we have here once again Matthew chapter 15, 21 through 28, and then again Mark chapter 7, where the same story appears. And let me find it here in Mark 7. Let's see, Mark 7. Yeah, what's interesting is Matthew calls her a Canaanite, which is a very loaded term for the Jews. For the Israelites, that was a very loaded term, a Canaanite. Mark uses a softer term. He calls her the Syro-Phoenician woman. Syro-Phoenician. That's a lighter way of speaking of her. To say Canaanite was to use a racial slur, really, for those times.
Yeah, because it was descendant of Cain.
Right.
What a Canaanite was.
Right.
And therefore,
Yeah, they were felt to be descendants of Cain.
and bitter towards God.
Yeah, bitter towards God. And they were just historic enemies of Israel, which raises a whole host of other issues that we won't deal with in this particular podcast. But
Well, but I mean, it does come up in the sense that she crossed the major terrain, not just physically, but also.
yeah, this is a border. It's a border crossing story.
Yeah.
That's what it is. It's the crossing of borders, and that is a hot topic then, and it's a hot topic now.
Yeah.
And it was just as hot in those days in its own ways. Yeah, that rhymed, by the way. So the Syro-Phoenician woman, should I read that in Mark? Do you mind if I read that?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me get my light here. From that place he went off to the district of Tyre. He entered a house and wanted no one to know about it, but he could not escape notice. Soon a woman whose daughter had an unclean spirit heard about him. She came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Greek, a Syro-Phoenician by birth, and she begged him to drive the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the food of the children and throw it to the dogs." She replied and said to him, "Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's scraps." Then he said to her, "For saying this, you may go. The demon has gone out of your daughter." When the woman went home, she found the child lying in bed and the demon gone. Here ends the story as Mark tells it. It's interesting that that whole exchange, part of that exchange is different in Mark than in Matthew.
Yeah.
He doesn't say, "Great is your faith."
No.
In Matthew, Jesus has a habit of talking about people of little faith and people of great faith. The disciples are often of little faith, but here Jesus calls this outsider, a Canaanite in Matthew, no less, a Canaanite. He calls her a person of great faith. Very interesting. Helmut Thielicke equates the Canaanite woman's perseverance. He equates her perseverance with the perseverance of Jacob. Because we see, of course, she has perseverance here, which means she puts up with even being kind of ridiculed, right?
Yeah.
Being called a dog. A Canaanite being called a canine by Jesus. She even endures that kind of, really for her, insulting language. And she meets it with humility. So her perseverance, Helmut Thielicke equates that with the perseverance of Jacob when he wrestles with God in Genesis chapter 32. That's Genesis chapter 32, verses 22 through 32. The famous wrestling match of Jacob with the unknown being of the night, which most commentators take to be God in that situation. So interesting. Jacob, a person of great historic import and faith to the Jews, to the Israelites. Helmut Thielicke sees a parallel between Jacob and this woman in her strength, her stick-to-itiveness, her perseverance.
Yeah, the fact that you have to wrestle with God and that it isn't a simple faith, isn't an easy faith either.
Yes. And Thielicke also mentions how her perseverance and the whole situation here reminds him of the Lord's Prayer, where we have Thielicke calls it an ironic request in the Lord's Prayer. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, right? God's will be done. Thielicke says that's kind of paradoxical, because if you're praying to God for His will to be done, then why are you praying, right?
Right.
It's a paradox. It's also, we could say it's a dialectic. It's a matter of tension between one point of view and another. Why would you pray for God's will to be done? If you want God's will to be done, why are you bothering to pray? That's a question we could.
Yeah. And then to
we
place
could-
the demand for bread on top of
Right.
understanding that it's within his ability to do, but he can choose not to.
Right. 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 Thy will be done. So it's kind of bold when we pray the Lord's Prayer. There's a lot of boldness in that prayer. There's a lot of paradox, a lot of tension, what some would call dialectic, two things sort of intermingling, and a bit of tension being present there. So you have here too, you have the silence of God and the rude remark that Jesus makes about the giving of children's bread to the dogs. Not fair to give the children's bread, in other words, Israel's bread, to the dogs, those Gentiles, especially those Canaanites, right? So that's Helmut Thielicke chalks it up to God's ways being higher than our ways. That's one of the ways he chalks it up here. It's one of the sort of, I would say, sort of a defense that he makes of this situation, because this situation troubles a lot of people. So Thielicke kind of chalks it up to when the Lord says in Isaiah, my ways are higher than your ways, right?
Yeah.
My ways are higher than your ways. And so Thielicke thinks that's part of what's going on here. God's ways are simply higher than our ways. Because we would ask, what's all this about Israel being the children and the Gentiles being dogs? I mean, in the first place. Paul said in his writings, to the Jew first and also to the Greek, right? To the Jew first and then to the Greek, meaning the outsider, the Gentile. So that's, we wonder about all of that. Thielicke says, once again, talks about God's ways being higher than our ways. We're also reminded where God's ways go beyond our reason, you might say, or our logic. You could think about Abraham and Isaac. I think that might be Genesis chapter 22, where Abraham is on the verge of sacrificing Isaac, the only heir really to the promise that's given to Abraham. So there's a lot of risk going on there, great risk on Abraham's part, to even be willing to sacrifice his own son Isaac, to sacrifice the promise itself. Interesting,
But repeated through this is the fact that she has a very simple faith and utter and complete faith in Jesus as the only source of salvation for her daughter. And Thielicke talks about the centurion of Capernaum.
The centurion?
The
Yep.
centurion.
Yep.
Who
Uh-huh.
was also the only other person that he said had great faith
Yeah, and he's an outsider,
as
right?
well. Yeah.
Yeah.
But he
Yeah.
just completely trusts that Jesus can do what he needs him to do.
Right.
And
Even at the point of risk, personal risk.
right.
Yeah. Yeah, great risk. Well, sometimes we call that the leap of faith. Throughout this whole story, I was reminded of Soren Kierkegaard talked about the leap of faith, right? That sometimes faith is a leap into the dark. We don't have all the answers as we operate in faith. Sometimes we operate, again, at great risk, right? It's like a leap in the dark at times. Then you have the other point that I think about is the famous Pascal's wager,
Yeah.
where Pascal said, sometimes you have to weigh things out. If the promise of God is wrong, if the promise that we hear in Scripture is wrong, what have we lost, right? Well, some would say we've lost nothing if it's wrong. then nihilism is the way things are, emptiness is the way things are. You haven't lost a thing. On the other hand, if you do the wager and operate in faith, so much is to be gained, being in what Dallas Willard calls the eternal quality of life, a great quality of life that's lived in faith would be the alternative. So then, anyway, I'm reminded of that. It's called Pascal's wager.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, Jordan Peterson seems to be very much in favor of Pascal's wager.
he operates. Yeah.
We got to see him the other day, and that was.
Yeah, we saw him in a lecture. Yep, and he seems to be very much in talking in terms of Pascal's wager, without, I think, using that terminology, but he does make use of it. You know, that life is sometimes a risk, as faith is oftentimes a risky venture. Yeah. Yeah. We have a turning point in the story here in verse 27 of Matthew 15. A turning point in the story is the woman's response, not only to the silence of Jesus that happens at first, but to the apparent rude rejection about calling her a dog, right? A turning point is her response to all of this. She says in the King James translation, truth, Lord, yet even the children can have the scraps from the dogs, or from the master's table, excuse me. Even the children get the scraps from the master's table. But she says, truth, Lord, meaning, okay, I accept this harsh judgment of being called a Canaanite, a canine, a dog, right? Mm-hmm. She accepts that in humility. So that's translated in the King James translation, truth, Lord. The word for truth in Greek is the word nai. It's pronounced nai in the Greek, the word for truth. And often it's translated simply in some translations as yes, yes, Lord, yes, Lord. Same meaning, really. If she says truth, Lord, that's another way of saying yes, Lord. Okay, yes, Lord, I accept that. I accept the sharpest edge of the sword there in that judgment about being a Canaanite, right? Being a dog. So in great humility she proceeds. And again, Thielicke calls that a turning point in the story.
Yeah.
I think we can see why that would be a turning point, right?
Well, he brings up when you're talking about the will be done of those who cannot boast the sufficiency or the correctness of their dogmatic belief. Nothing of my own I bring, thou, O Lord, art everything. Those who have a hungry heart and a broken spirit are the favorites of God. Which is very interesting, that you can feel like such an outcast and such a lowly, horrible person, which this woman must feel at being cast aside and called a dog. She's from a hated class of people. She's not at home. She's among enemies. And she's begging at the foot of God, and he restores her faith completely. And by being completely humbled before him, she becomes worthy of him. If she came to him in arrogance or demanded his attention, I don't think he would have saved her daughter.
Yeah, it's hard to say, yeah, in God's grace, whether he would have saved her. But certainly she shows humility. Yeah. Yeah, she certainly shows humility. And that's why many churches practice public confession and absolution. Public confession, and then the promise of forgiveness is stated in worship, for this very reason. Yeah. The tradition in which I worked as a pastor for years, the Lutheran Church, we have public confession of sins every Sunday, which is not that you confess individual evils of your, you don't do that publicly, but you make a general confession of faith, or confession of sin, which is I have sinned against God and I've sinned against my neighbor, right? We've sinned against God. We have not loved our neighbors as ourselves, and then we ask for God's forgiveness. That's part of the attempt in public worship to show a sense of humility that we are about as Christians.
Mm-hmm.
Not all Christian traditions practice that,
No.
but it's not a bad idea. Since I worked in it for 37 years, the church in which I was raised, they never would do that. They wouldn't. I was raised in a different group, and they would never have practiced public general confession like that.
Yeah. And as far as I know, the Methodists and Nazarene don't do that as well. It's more of a private, direct to God between the two of you. Catholic tradition, you're confessing to a priest who intercedes on your behalf.
That's their private confession. Yes,
Yeah.
right. Lutherans do that sometimes too, but it's not a common practice in the Lutheran Church. But we do allow for that.
Okay.
You could go privately to the pastor and confess sins, and then receive the word of forgiveness. Sometimes it's good to do that. I had a teacher in seminary. He suggested that individual Christians do that sometimes with each other.
Okay.
If you have a very trusting friendship, you can do that.
Yeah.
And then one person confesses their wrongs to their friend, and the friend as a Christian could respond with, "You are forgiven for Jesus' sake."
Okay.
And so that can be practiced among individuals too. But the reason those practices exist at all is I think it's a nodding toward the sense of humility that's which is helpful in faith, such as the woman shows.
Do you find that there's a lot of, by confessing in public, do you find that there are people who are more harshly critical of people? You know what I mean? Like, if you're confessing in public, are there people that aren't going to forgive you for your sins?
Oh,
or
yeah.
Going to hold it
Well,
over you?
that's why the public confession is generally, in our tradition,
Okay.
it's generally not specific.
Okay.
Nobody stands up and says, I robbed airplane glue from the store yesterday. I bring that up because my brother and I did that when I was a kid. That's my public confession of a private sin there.
Okay.
But yeah, you don't stand up in our services. You don't stand up and confess a sin of that nature.
Okay.
There are Christian traditions that do that,
Okay.
but that, in my experience, that's not usually the way the Lutheran Church is operated.
Okay.
Yeah, but there are traditions that do. Yeah, I've known of that. Some evangelical churches even. Which I won't name the specific churches, but I know of some evangelical churches that occasionally have a person stand up in front of the whole congregation and admit
all the things he did.
Maybe not everything they've done, but something that the church feels should be specifically dealt with in public. You know?
Yeah.
That gets a little dicey.
I imagine.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, I've known people that have had to confess, like they've gone through various struggles in life with certain kinds of certain levels of divorce in their lives and things like that, and they've had to stand up in front of the church and confess. You know.
Okay.
Yeah, there was a church. There was a church in my home area where one of the staff had an affair with another person in the staff. And they both had to stand up on Sunday morning in that church, confess the wrong, and ask for forgiveness of the congregation and all of that stuff. Yeah. So it takes different levels. I'm not a fan of that particular approach, you know.
Yeah.
But I do think it's helpful to have what we do is the general confession, which is, dear God, I've sinned against you, and I have not loved my neighbor as myself. Please forgive me. I think that's a good start, at least, in humility for all of us, you know.
I can see that.
Admitting that we are sinners, right? That we have failings, that we have weaknesses, you know.
Yeah. But I think a lot of people fear other people more than they fear God.
Oh,
When it
yeah.
comes to confessing in front of other people.
Right, because people aren't, to be honest, people usually are not as forgiving as God is.
Yeah.
So, you know,
And we see that in
Yeah.
here because she doesn't go to the
Disciples.
apostles,
Right.
the disciples,
right, right,
because she does not think that they can help her.
right. Yeah, she's not going to them.
In fact, she says she realizes, however, that they are not merciful in yielding to her cry for help. They have poor nerves. This makes some people seem to be sympathetic and neighborly, but they are not. An invalid and wayside beggar do not really believe in the mercy of men. Otherwise, they would not utter so frequently their moving complaints.
Right,
And that's because he says the silence of God is not to be measured by the standards of men.
right, right. So we have here quite a clear story which shows that, especially in Judaism and Christianity, we have a clear distinction between God's ways and our ways, right? You know, our logic and God's ways. A clear distinction being made. God is other. God is other than we. You know.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting at some point, perhaps in this, maybe we can, as we continue this recording, at some point, other people have dealt with the same passage, and it's what they have had to say about this passage is also interesting and often very similar to what Helmut Thielicke has said.
Yeah.
You know.
That article you sent me was very interesting.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. That he talks about how that Jesus died on the cross cannot be taken for granted. And I'm just going to read this paragraph.
Okay,
It's on
read.
page 18.
Okay.
We European Christians have gradually become accustomed to the dangerous and unhealthy idea that the grace of God is thrown at us. Voltaire cynically said of the forgiveness of God, I'm not going to say that in French, it is his job. But this is not so. Things are quite different than the popular assumption. The kingdom of God is not thrust on us. The grace of God can also be silent. We certainly cannot claim it. It may be, and if so, I cannot blame God, that in my last hour I will sink into darkness, and the one figure who might be with me through the gloomy portal will be missing. It is no sense of duty or obligation of Jesus to bear my sin and take me through the black gate of death. If he does this, it cannot be taken for granted. And I make bold to say that even the most orthodox churchman will not enter the kingdom of heaven unless he is continuously surprised that mercy has been shown him. And I think that's just, and especially this paragraph down here. Perhaps God has to first be jerked away from us, complacent Western Christians, like a rug from under our feet, if we are to be reawakened to this surprise. And I think that is currently happening, especially in Europe. You're seeing complacent Christians who are welcoming and open and loving, having their faith and their culture taken from them by violent people who do not respect the rights of people to worship as they like or love how they like. And it is a battlefield that's going on over there. Like, there's a certain level of welcoming people in with open arms, but you can only do that so long as they are coming in with open arms, if that makes sense.
Yeah, there's definitely a tension there. That raises a whole host of issues, though, for the Christian who follows Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, right? Turn the other cheek and all of that. Raises a lot of issues. It does, yeah. How open are we to be in light of God's openness? That's a big question. That raises a lot of issues, yeah.
I still feel that modern Western Christians are very complacent in their faith. You're seeing a lot of people say, "Oh yeah, I'm Christian," but they don't go to church. Sure. They don't read the Bible.
Right.
They don't.
Right.
Practice it in their life.
Right. Well, I think what that really does is it raises the issue about how the word Christian gets used. I think, yeah.
Yeah.
It gets used, yeah. It raises the issue, what is genuine Christianity and what isn't, right? What is genuine Christianity? What isn't? That you get into some real serious issues on that, important issues, yeah. William Willimon once pointed out that there were Christians living in Iraq under Saddam Hussein, right? There were Christians living there. There were in particular, he mentions Mennonite Christians who lived there, right?
Okay.
Nonviolent Mennonites. And somebody said, how in the world did they, how could Mennonite Christians function in Iraq under Saddam Hussein? And I think one of the answers was, well, they occupy a different kingdom than Saddam Hussein. Christianity is a different kingdom.
Interesting.
Yeah, that was his. William Willimon actually is the one that said that. But he's written on these issues a lot. He and his he has a dialogue partner who taught. They both taught at Duke University. But Stanley Hauerwas was his dialogue partner. They wrote a lot of books together about this stuff, right?
Yeah.
And Hauerwas took this whole issue seriously, but their way of addressing it is that Christianity they would say is its own culture in a sense, that no matter what's going on around Christians are called to a different sphere,
Okay.
a different way of being. Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Because there's I forget what chapter it is. I think it's in John where he says, I've chosen you out of this world. You do not belong to the world.
Right.
If you belong to the world, then the world would welcome you. But because
Right.
I've chosen you out of it,
Right.
the world will reject you.
Right. Right. And that's so Hauerwas and Willimon would they take that kind of thing very seriously, and they that's for, as a matter of fact, on that basis, they reject the notion that there's such a thing as a quote Christian nation.
Okay.
They would say a Christian nation is impossible.
That makes sense.
You know, the only thing possible is to follow Christ, but the nation can never do that. That's what they would argue. The nation can never do that.
And I could agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that I would want to live in a place that claimed to be a Christian nation, because I think that it would become warped.
Right, and there's a movement today in that regard.
Yeah.
You know, it's the well, some call it the Christian nationalist movement, but there is a movement of that nature where there are Christians who think that we should take over the government and actually Christians should actually run the state.
Yeah, that's not.
And that is thoroughly rejected, especially by Hauerwas and Willimon. They
Yeah.
thoroughly reject that. Because they see their argument is that's what happened with the Holy Roman Empire.
Yeah.
That's where Christianity went wrong. That's what they argue.
Yeah.
When Christianity became part of the empire, that was the beginning, in their view, of the downfall of Christianity. And so their task, as they see it, is to call Christians to realize that we live in a different kingdom, even within other kingdoms, whether they're Russian or American or Latin American or whatever they are. Christians are called to a different. Yeah.
Yeah. I would
That's a
agree
big
with that.
issue. It's a big issue. Yeah.
Yeah. I would agree that I would reject the idea of a Christian nation.
Yeah, I don't agree with the Christian nation talk, either. Yeah.
Yeah. Also, especially since it seems like Jesus seems to prefer the lowly. I
Right.
don't know.
Yeah.
You just ask
Right. He
him
doesn't
what-
say you need to become an Israelite to that girl, right? To the
No.
woman. Yeah.
No, and you
Yeah.
don't need the theology, and you don't need the doctrine, and you don't need all
Right.
of that.
Right.
It's just,
Yeah.
have mercy on me.
Yeah. Have mercy on me, son of David. She calls him, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Have mercy on me, son of David. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, as Thielicke says, can you pass by someone who set all these aside and expects everything only of your love and generous hands? And Jesus cannot. This woman takes Jesus at his own words, especially in saying that he loves the hungry and thirsty and spiritually poor, and that he will not despise a contrite heart. She has done what none other can do, namely entangled the Savior in his talk. She's flung the sack of his promises at his feet, and he cannot step over it. And that's basically all you can do.
Yep. Yeah, it's said of Martin Luther that when he was feeling depressed, he went through great depressions his whole life. You know, he was known for going through great bouts of depression.
Yeah.
And they said that when he felt particularly plagued by evil and sadness, it is said that he would take his baptismal certificate and he would raise it to the air and say to God, "You promised. You've made a promise to me." And that's the only thing Luther could cling to, was that promise.
Yeah.
You know, the fact that he was something outside of himself had happened to him, which was his baptism accompanied by God's word. That was the only thing to which he could cling. Finally.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that's for me at least. That's the message of Christianity. That is finally all that we have to cling to, is the promise of God, which comes from outside of us.
Okay.
Not something we have to conjure up within ourselves or feel right about or something, right? I was raised in a church group that you had to feel right about it almost, right? You had to have the right feelings about your faith.
Yeah.
And I found that to be kind of an empty thing, because your feelings go up and down.
Yeah.
There are days I feel great about my faith. There's days I feel lousy about my faith, right?
Yeah.
So if it's attached to my feelings, it doesn't work very well.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Thielicke talks about that because at the time he's writing this, it's
Yeah.
middle of Stalingrad,
Right.
and it's terrible out there. And he talks about walking with friends who basically say that they just don't have the knack for the prayer. Like, they want to pray, but they want
Right.
to have faith.
Right.
We just can't. They just don't feel like they belong, and they don't feel like
Right.
they have the gift of faith.
Right. Right.
And I don't know how to explain faith, because I don't think that it comes easy to anyone, really.
Right. Right.
I mean, I guess when you're young, it's easier, but then as you go through things in life, it's very difficult to be like, yeah, this really crappy thing happened to me, but surely God's got a plan. Really?
Right, right.
Come on. You gotta have a plan.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
And then you may never see the reason. Sometimes you do. I've
Yeah. It's difficult. Yeah.
I've gone I've gone years and then found out, oh, that's why I went through that. That's why I suffered here. But
Yeah.
I don't always get an answer for why,
Right.
or see a reason
Right. We don't always see reasons. Yeah. You're
other
right.
than him toughening me up for more trials.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
just making me stronger. So
Yeah. We learn from adversity. We don't always have any answer for it. Yeah. 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 And it's a genuine struggle. Yeah. That's a genuine struggle.
yeah,
Yeah.
okay, we're good.
All right. I have a book of sermons by one of my old teachers, Roy A. Harrisville. He was a very good New Testament scholar, and he did interesting sermons on different texts. He has a sermon on Matthew 15:21 through 28, which is the text that we're dealing with, about what we call the Cannite woman. And Harrisville writes these words in regard to that text. I quote, "But he did not answer her a word. The one who's talking fills up 66 books, didn't say a word. Suppose we finish her story 20th century style. She didn't hang around, she went home, and every time she looked at her child, moaning and soiling the bed sheets, she thought of what might have been. She read a few books on prayer, supposing there could have been something wrong with the way that she had prayed hers. But in the end, decided that there was nothing to it. When the poor little idiot died, she was relieved, though it made her feel guilty. She spent the rest of her days between relief and guilt, confusion and bitterness, and when she died, the folks in town said, "Well, there goes old Maud. Peculiar old cuss." But the woman hung on. In spite of that dreadful silence, she hung on. She refused to read into that silence anything else than a disguise. And what is faith if it isn't a hanging on, a hoping, a clinging to God in spite of the silence? You and I cannot endure much silence from God. We want an answer pronto. And when it doesn't come, in a split second, we peep our heads out of our little watchtowers with fidgety Habakkuk, and we yell, "O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and thou wilt not hear?" Then he spoke. But as one preacher has put it, what he said sounded suspiciously like this. It sounded like, "Madam, I hear prayers, but only Jewish prayers." This was worse than the silence, because it appeared that the word to which she had clung in spite of the silence was not a word for her at all. By all odds, she should have surrendered. She should have surrendered the word that she'd heard. She should have begun looking around for another word, someone else's word. But this woman, for whom even the solidest peg of all on which to hang her faith had disappeared, she hung on in spite of she hung on with a kind of bare and naked hope. Once more she pleaded, "Lord, help me." And for all her trouble, she got a mouthful of sheer, pure discourtesy. It is not fair to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. But she parried his thrust. "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs." He had compared her to a dog and her prayer to begging for a bone. Well, she conceded the comparison, but she twisted that word which had made the most against her to her own advantage. She tripped him up in his own speech. 1,000 years before, Jacob, wrestling with the angel at Peniel, from sunset to dawn, wounded but still holding on, spat out the words, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Faith, battered and bruised, twisting out of a headlock and winning out, walked off with the blessing. That woman knew how to wring a yes out of God's no. But she couldn't have done it if he hadn't wanted it so. That's a key thing, by the way. She couldn't have done it if he hadn't wanted it so, if the yes hadn't been there all along, hidden beneath the sign of its opposite. I've forgotten the artist and the name of the picture, but someone has drawn a portrait of a man surrounded by breakers and a swirling sea, and surf pounding against those breakers, like to kill a man. The fellow in the picture has his head and shoulders barely above water, but with two strong arms, he's holding on to a mass of rock, hanging on for dear life, and he looks as though he'll hang on forever, with the smart of the spray in his eyes, his body soaked in the drenching flood. Now that is what it means to believe, to hang on in the darkness and in the silence, to endure the reproach of God, to concede his judgment, and still, as Luther says, quote, never to stand off from praying, till thou overcomest as she overcame, till thou hast turned the very charges made against thee into arguments and proofs of thy need, till thou too hast taken Christ in his own words. Hang on, brother, and you'll wring a yes out of God's no. End of sermon.
That was a good sermon.
He was a good preacher.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was a nice way to handle it. And he made, like Thielicke, the comparison with Jacob wrestling.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what I think is key to and it's key to his theology too. It's a key to Lutheran theology, which is that there never would have been a yes had there not been one all along. God's yes is there. Yeah. Yeah. There wouldn't have been a yes had there not been one there all along. Yeah.
Is it a potential yes? Is simply the potential of a yes, or is it?
In my opinion,
you have to earn the yes.
no, we don't have to earn the yes. No, I don't think we have
But
to.
she has to hold on.
She holds on. Yep, she holds on.
And if she hadn't held on, would she have gotten the yes or not?
Good question. The yes still would be there. Maybe not. Maybe she wouldn't have received the benefit in that sense. The benefit.
Yeah.
But the yes is still there. You know, it's kind of it's a paradox, I think.
Okay.
God's yes is always there. Yeah. Whether we receive like the peace of mind that comes with Christ's grace. Christ's grace, I think, is always there for us. I think that your quote unsaved neighbor, in my opinion, our unsaved neighbor is already saved, but doesn't know it. That's my view. That's my view, and not everybody will agree with that, but that is my view. I think we have God's benefits. Not knowing it though, we don't enjoy the peace that comes with it, right?
Okay.
Right. Yeah. We can still live a life in hopelessness and despair because we don't trust that God has said yes to us.
Okay.
Yeah.
I can see that.
Yeah. See, this gets into a lot of theological issues that we don't not necessarily want to get into in this podcast, but
we'll stick with the simple faith that she had.
Yeah.
It worked for her. It should work for us too, without the theological
right
complexities.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us today. Do we want to wrap it up? Or?
Yeah, we can wrap this up for today. Thank you for being with us today. We're pleased to have you listening or watching, and we look forward to other sessions with you.
If you have any comments or prayer requests or topics, discussions that you want to talk with us about, leave a comment down below. Please like, share, and subscribe. And we will see you all in a couple weeks. Thanks. Bye.
God bless you. Bye-bye.
Bye.